The Geiger counter screamed like a wounded animal as Dr. Sarah Chen swept it across the abandoned cabin's rotting floorboards. Outside, West Virginia's Appalachian fog clung to the mountainside like smoke from a funeral pyre, while inside, the metallic tang of decay mixed with something else, something that made her radiation detector spike into the red zone every few seconds. The wood itself seemed to pulse with an invisible energy that had been burning through this bloodline for over 6 decades. This discovery would rewrite everything we thought we knew about Cold War experiments and their lasting consequences on human genetics. The call had come on October 15, 2019, from a social worker who'd found the family during a welfare check. 3 generations living in squalor, their bodies twisted by mutations that defied medical explanation. But it wasn't until Chen's team from the Centers for Disease Control arrived with their equipment that the true horror revealed itself. The house wasn't just contaminated, it was a radiation signature that matched classified government records from 1957. The family called themselves the Holloways, though records suggested their real name had been lost decades ago. The eldest member, a woman in her 70s who introduced herself only as Granny, possessed skin that appeared translucent in certain light, revealing a network of veins that glowed faintly blue. Her grandson, barely 30, but aged beyond his years, had been born with extra fingers that seemed to bend in impossible directions. The youngest child, a girl of maybe 12, spoke in whispers and refused to leave the cabin's darkest corner. But here's what chilled Chen to her bones. When she asked Granny about her parents, the old woman's milky eyes focused with sudden clarity. "Daddy came back from the mountain different," she whispered. Said, "The white coats gave him medicine, made him strong, but strong ain't the same as right." From a declassified CDC field report, October 16, 2019, preliminary genetic analysis reveals chromosomal damage consistent with acute radiation exposure. Mutations appear hereditary, suggesting multi-generational contamination. Recommend immediate evacuation and further investigation. The mountain that loomed behind their cabin was Pikes Ridge, a name that appeared in heavily redacted government files Chen had spent months trying to access. During the height of the Cold War, the Atomic Energy Commission had conducted experiments across rural America, often using prisoners and mental patients as unwitting test subjects. But Pikes Ridge represented something different, something the government had tried very hard to erase from history. 23 prisoners had been transported to a facility hidden deep in those mountains during the summer of 1957. According to the few surviving records, they were part of an experiment designed to test human resistance to radiation exposure. The official story claimed all subjects had died within weeks. But standing in that contaminated cabin, watching a family whose DNA still carried the atomic signature of those experiments, Chen realized the official story was a lie. The prisoners hadn't died. They'd been released back into the mountains, carrying mutations in their genes like time bombs set to explode across generations. And somehow, impossibly, their descendants were still living in the shadow of that atomic nightmare. Where are you watching from right now? And what time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if stories like this fascinate you, real government cover-ups that shaped entire bloodlines, hit that like button and subscribe. Because what we discovered next in those declassified files will change how you view everything you thought you knew about Cold War America. The radiation readings were just the beginning. Because when Chen's team started digging into the Holloway family tree, they discovered something that made the contaminated cabin look like child's play. The experiment at Pikes Ridge hadn't been about testing human endurance at all. Atoms don't forget. Neither do genes. The basement archives of the National Security Agency smelled like mothballs and government secrets, while fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like dying insects. Chen's security clearance had taken 8 months to process, But now she sat surrounded by boxes marked classified in fading red stamps, their contents revealing a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the Eisenhower administration. Each manila folder felt heavy with the weight of lives deliberately destroyed in the name of national security. The files would expose how 23 men became unwitting guinea pigs in an experiment designed to create the perfect atomic soldier. Project Prometheus had begun in 1956 as a joint operation between the Atomic Energy Commission and the Pentagon's Special Projects Division. The goal was simple in its horror: discover whether humans could be conditioned to survive nuclear warfare through controlled radiation exposure. The test subjects were chosen from Moundsville Penitentiary's death row men society had already written off, whose disappearances would raise no questions. The facility at Pikes Ridge had been constructed in absolute secrecy, hidden beneath what appeared to be a routine mining operation. Local residents were told the government was testing new drilling techniques for coal extraction. What they didn't know was that deep underground, scientists were conducting experiments that violated every principle of medical ethics established since the Nuremberg trials. Dr. Marcus Brennan led the research team, a man whose previous work included studying radiation effects on Japanese survivors of Hiroshima. His notes, preserved in meticulous detail, revealed a mind capable of viewing human beings as nothing more than laboratory specimens. Subject exhibits promising cellular adaptation at 15 Röntgen exposure. Read one entry, dated July 12, 1957. Recommend doubling dosage to test upper tolerance thresholds. But here's where the official narrative crumbled. The prisoners didn't die from radiation poisoning, as government records claimed. Instead, their bodies underwent cellular mutations that allowed them to survive doses that should have been instantly lethal. Brennan's team had accidentally created something they hadn't intended: humans whose DNA had been fundamentally altered by atomic exposure. The breakthrough came when Chen discovered a handwritten memo tucked between official reports, penned by Brennan himself on August 20th, 1957. Subjects display remarkable adaptation. Cellular regeneration exceeds all projections, recommending immediate termination of experiment and disposal of all evidence. What we have created here cannot be allowed to exist. Yet the subjects weren't terminated. According to shipping manifests Chen found buried in another file, they were loaded onto trucks and transported back to various locations throughout Appalachia on August 23, 1957. The official explanation was that their bodies were being returned to families for burial. But Chen now knew the truth. These men were still alive, their bodies forever changed by the atomic fire that had rewritten their genetic code. The contamination spread through bloodlines like ripples in poisoned water. Children born to the surviving subjects carried mutations in their DNA, extra limbs, organs that glowed faintly in darkness, skin that registered on Geiger counters decades after the initial exposure. Local doctors, sworn to secrecy by government agents, treated these families in silence while recording their observations in coded medical files. One such file, discovered in a defunct clinic near Charleston, documented the birth of a child whose mother had married one of the Pikes Ridge subjects. Infant exhibits luminescence in cranial region. The doctor wrote, "Parents report child does not require normal amounts of sleep. Recommend continued observation, but no intervention." But what happened to the families who tried to speak out, who questioned why their children were born different? The answer lay in a pattern Chen discovered while cross-referencing death certificates with military personnel records. Suspicious accidents, house fires, sudden illnesses that defied medical explanation. The government had spent decades cleaning up the evidence of Project Prometheus, but they couldn't erase the genetic damage that continued spreading through Appalachian bloodlines. Every birth was a potential exposure. Every family reunion a gathering of the atomically altered. What would you do if you discovered your own family tree was rooted in government experimentation? If the mutations in your children's DNA could be traced back to men in white coats who played God with atomic fire? The trail of evidence led Chen back to the mountains, where the descendants of Project Prometheus still lived in the shadow of their ancestors' contamination. The Adams were patient. They could wait. The limestone walls of Moundsville Penitentiary still echoed with the screams of men who'd been promised freedom, but found something far worse. Built in 1876, the Gothic fortress had housed West Virginia's most dangerous criminals for over a century. But by the 1950s, it served a different purpose, a recruitment ground for government experiments that required subjects society wouldn't miss. The warden's office records, discovered during Chen's investigation, revealed payments of $50,000 per prisoner transferred to federal research programs. These payments would expose a systematic pipeline that fed human test subjects directly into the atomic furnaces of Project Prometheus. Warden Harold Kemp had run Moundsville with the efficiency of a corporate executive, viewing his inmates as inventory to be managed and monetized. When federal agents arrived in spring of 1957, seeking volunteers for medical research that could commute death sentences, Kemp saw an opportunity to clear his most expensive residence while padding the prison's budget. The men he selected weren't random. They were chosen for specific physical characteristics that would maximize experimental data. The selection criteria, found in Kemp's personal files, read like a livestock auction catalog. Subjects must be between 25 and 40 years old, minimum weight 160 pounds, no history of radiation exposure or genetic abnormalities. Each prisoner underwent extensive medical examinations, disguised as routine health checks. Their blood samples secretly analyzed for baseline genetic markers that would later help scientists track mutation progression. Thomas Holloway was inmate number 4789, sentenced to death for killing a man during a bar fight in Logan County. Prison photographs showed a lean man with dark eyes and calloused hands, someone who'd spent his life working coal mines before violence changed his trajectory. His medical file noted exceptional physical stamina and rapid healing from minor injuries qualities that made him an ideal candidate for Project Prometheus. But the prisoners weren't told they were volunteering for atomic experiments. According to testimony Chen found in sealed court records, they believed they were testing new medications that could cure cancer. The consent forms they signed were deliberate deceptions, describing innovative treatments for cellular regeneration without mentioning radiation exposure. Several inmates who later tried to back out were told their death sentences would be carried out immediately if they refused to continue. The transport to Pikes Ridge occurred on June 15, 1957, in unmarked military vehicles that traveled only at night. Local sheriff departments had been instructed to ignore any unusual convoy activity, while state police received orders to provide escort without asking questions. The 23 men disappeared into the mountains as completely as if they'd never existed. From a classified Army transport log, cargo delivered to Facility PR 7 at 0300 hours. Subjects conscious and cooperative. Dr. Brennan confirmed receipt of all materials intact. What the transport logs didn't record was the fear in those men's eyes as they were led underground into chambers lined with lead and equipped with radiation monitoring equipment. Thomas Holloway, according to witness accounts discovered decades later, was the first to realize they'd been betrayed when he saw the atomic warning symbols painted on laboratory doors. "This ain't no medicine," he reportedly told fellow prisoner James Morrison. "This is something else entirely." The experiments began immediately. Each subject was exposed to controlled doses of radiation, while scientists monitored their cellular responses through blood samples, tissue biopsies, and full body scans that left them weak and nauseated. Dr. Brennan's notes described the process with clinical detachment. Initial exposure of 5 Roentgen produces expected symptoms: vomiting, hair loss, cellular breakdown. However, subjects 4, 7, 8, 9, and 6, 2, 3, 1 show unusual regenerative properties by day 7. Some prisoners died within weeks, their bodies unable to adapt to the atomic assault on their DNA. But others, including Thomas Holloway, underwent transformations that defied medical understanding. Their hair grew back thicker and darker. Their wounds healed with supernatural speed. Most remarkably, their bodies seemed to develop a tolerance for radiation that increased with each exposure. The breaking point came when one of the subjects, a man named Carl Bishop, began exhibiting phosphorescent properties in his skin tissue. Dr. Brennan's team realized they'd created something beyond their ability to control or understand. The decision to terminate the project came not from ethical concerns, but from fear of what they'd unleashed. What happened next would haunt the mountains of West Virginia for generations to come, as men transformed by atomic fire returned to a world that could never accept what they'd become. But the government had one final betrayal waiting, one that would ensure their atomic experiment continued long after Project Prometheus officially ended. The DNA remembered everything, every dose, every betrayal. The mountain air tasted like copper and shame as Thomas Holloway stepped off the government truck that August night in 1957, his body forever changed by 3 months of atomic fire. The familiar ridgelines of Logan County stretched before him in the moonlight. But everything felt different now. Colors appeared more vivid, sounds carried farther, and his skin tingled with an energy that would never fade. Behind him, 22 other survivors clutched discharge papers that warned them never to speak of their experiences at Pikes Ridge. These men carried mutations in their DNA that would poison their bloodlines for generations, but nobody told them they were walking time bombs. The government's plan was elegantly simple: release the survivors back into isolated Appalachian communities where their eventual deaths from radiation sickness would be attributed to mining accidents or natural causes. Federal agents had already visited local doctors, providing them with cover stories about industrial accidents that might cause unusual symptoms in certain patients. Cash payments ensured silence, while death certificates were pre-signed with vague causes like respiratory failure or cardiac arrest. But Dr. Brennan's team had miscalculated. The men who returned from Pikes Ridge weren't dying, they were adapting. Thomas Holloway found his way back to his cabin near Blair Mountain, where his wife Mary waited with their 2 young children. The reunion should have been joyful, but Mary noticed changes immediately. Thomas no longer needed much sleep. His appetite had vanished, and his body temperature ran several degrees below normal. Most disturbing were the physical changes she discovered in their bedroom. Thomas's skin had developed a faint luminescence that was barely visible in daylight, but glowed like moonlight in complete darkness. When he cut himself shaving, the wound healed within hours, leaving no scar. Mary documented these changes in her diary, entries that would later provide crucial evidence for Chen's investigation. From Mary Holloway's diary, September 3rd, 1957. Thomas ain't the same man who left. Says the government doctors fixed something broken inside him, but I think they broke something that was working fine. The children are scared to hug their daddy. Can't blame them, he feels cold as Riverstone. The other survivors experienced similar homecomings throughout West Virginia, Kentucky, and southwestern Virginia. James Morrison returned to his family in Pike County with bones that had become dense as iron, requiring him to relearn how to walk without breaking floorboards. Carl Bishop, whose skin phosphorescence had terrified Dr. Brennan's team, found work in coal mines where his natural luminescence made him valuable as a living safety light. Local communities initially welcomed their men home, but whispers began circulating about strange changes in the returned prisoners. Wives spoke quietly about husbands who no longer felt entirely human. Children avoided fathers whose touch felt unnaturally cold. Church congregations noticed that certain families had stopped attending Sunday services, as if something shameful had infected their households. The contamination revealed itself most clearly when the survivors began having children. Babies born to Project Prometheus subjects carried genetic mutations that manifested in increasingly dramatic ways. Some children were born with extra digits that moved independently. Others exhibited unusual sensory abilities, seeing in complete darkness or hearing conversations from impossible distances. Medical records from rural clinics, discovered during Chen's investigation, documented dozens of births that defied scientific explanation. Dr. Sarah Whitman, a country physician who treated several survivor families, kept detailed notes despite government pressure to remain silent. Her records revealed a pattern of mutations that seemed to intensify with each generation. The Holloway infant displays cranial bone density 3 times normal parameters, she wrote in 1958. Motor development appears accelerated, with evidence of premature cognitive function. Recommend continued observation. But the most chilling discovery came when these unusual children began dying under suspicious circumstances. House fires struck families known to harbor atomic secrets. Carbon monoxide poisoning claimed entire households in single nights. Children with the most obvious mutations suffered fatal accidents that local authorities investigated with suspicious brevity. Government cleanup crews worked systematically through Appalachian communities, eliminating evidence of Project Prometheus one family at a time. They operated under cover of natural disasters, convincing local officials that gas leaks, electrical fires, and mining accidents were simply the normal hazards of mountain life. Coroners signed death certificates without performing autopsies, while surviving family members were relocated to different states with new identities. Thomas Holloway sensed the danger closing around his family when neighbors began disappearing. He made a desperate decision in the winter of 1958, taking Mary and their children deeper into the mountains where government agents couldn't easily follow. They established a hidden homestead in a hollow so remote it appeared on no official maps, living off the land while Thomas's atomic-altered body provided protection from the harsh environment. What would you do if you discovered your government had poisoned your bloodline, then spent decades hunting your family to cover up their crimes? If the choice was between hiding in the wilderness or watching your children die in suspicious accidents, the Holloways weren't the only family to disappear into Appalachian isolation, carrying their atomic secrets into the deepest corners of the mountains. But isolation couldn't stop the mutations from spreading through their genes like wildfire through dry timber. The mountains kept their secrets. But secrets have a way of glowing in the dark. The screaming began at 3:17 a.m. on March 9, 1962, echoing through the remote hollow where the Holloway family had hidden for nearly 4 years. Inside their cabin, Mary clutched her newborn daughter, while Thomas paced the floor, his luminescent skin casting eerie shadows on log walls, scarred by years of isolation. The baby's cries weren't normal. They resonated at frequencies that made glass vibrate and caused their hunting dogs to flee into the forest whimpering. This child would be the first of a new generation, born with mutations so extreme they defied every law of human biology. Little Ruth Holloway emerged from the womb with eyes that glowed pale green in darkness, and skin that registered 15 Röntgen on the Geiger counter Thomas had stolen from a government vehicle years earlier. Her fingernails grew at impossible rates, requiring daily trimming to prevent them from becoming claws. Most unnervingly, she seemed to understand adult conversation from her first weeks of life, tracking speakers with an intelligence that terrified even her atomic-altered father. The isolation that had protected the Holloway family from government cleanup crews now became a prison. Thomas couldn't risk taking Ruth to any doctor, knowing that her obvious mutations would trigger immediate federal intervention. Mary, weakened by a pregnancy complicated by her husband's radioactive DNA, struggled to care for a child whose needs defied maternal instincts, developed over millennia of normal human evolution. Their older children, born before Thomas's transformation at Pikes Ridge, began displaying secondary mutations as they approached adolescence. 10-year-old Samuel developed the ability to see through solid objects, describing the contents of closed containers with impossible accuracy. His sister Margaret, 8 years old, discovered she could make small animals fall asleep simply by touching them. These abilities fascinated and horrified their parents in equal measure. But the Holloways weren't the only family breeding atomic secrets in Appalachian isolation. Across the mountains, other Project Prometheus survivors had established hidden communities where their mutated bloodlines could develop without government interference. These settlements, connected by networks of hunters and moonshiners who asked no questions, formed an underground society of the atomically altered. From a letter between Mary Holloway and Sarah Morrison, dated June 7, 1963, "Your James sounds like he's having the same troubles with his youngest. Little ones born after the mountain are different. Not just the glowing and the strange dreams, they see things that ain't there. Or maybe see things that are there, but we can't see them. Sometimes I catch Ruth talking to empty corners, like someone's listening." The children born to second-generation survivors exhibited mutations that compounded exponentially. Carl Bishop's grandson could walk through solid rock, disappearing into cave walls and emerging miles away. James Morrison's daughter gave birth to twins who shared a telepathic connection so powerful they could experience each other's pain across vast distances. These abilities came with costs, shortened lifespans, vulnerability to certain frequencies of light, and an increasing inability to tolerate contact with normal humans. Local legends began forming around these mountain families. Hunters reported encounters with pale figures who moved through forests without disturbing leaves or branches. Children in valley towns whispered about the glowing people who lived in caves and only emerged during new moon nights. Church congregations developed rituals for blessing homes against atomic spirits that could steal away healthy children and replace them with changelings. The mutations reached a critical threshold in the mid-1960s when several atomic families began producing children who couldn't survive outside radioactive environments. These babies required constant exposure to uranium ore to maintain basic cellular functions, essentially becoming human nuclear reactors whose lives depended on atomic fuel. Thomas Holloway watched his youngest son slowly weaken and die when their uranium supply was exhausted during a harsh winter in 1966. The grief and desperation drove some families to desperate measures. Samuel Bishop, grandson of the original survivor, raided medical facilities searching for radioactive materials to keep his dying children alive. His break-in at Charleston General Hospital in 1967 resulted in the theft of cesium-137 used for cancer treatments, triggering the first major federal investigation into atomic survivors since the original Project Prometheus cover-up. This theft would reveal that the government had never stopped monitoring the descendants of their atomic experiment. Hidden surveillance networks had been tracking bloodlines for over a decade, documenting mutations, mapping genetic inheritance patterns, and preparing for the day when intervention became necessary. The stolen cesium provided the excuse they needed to launch Operation Cleanse Sweep, a systematic elimination of all Project Prometheus bloodlines. Federal agents descended on Appalachian communities with radiation detectors and genealogy charts, hunting families whose DNA still carried the atomic signature of their ancestors' exposure. Local law enforcement received orders to cooperate fully, while medical facilities were instructed to report any patients exhibiting unusual symptoms consistent with radiation exposure. But the atomic families had learned to hide in plain sight, disguising their mutations behind rural superstitions and mountain folklore. They developed techniques for masking their luminescence, controlling their unusual abilities, and blending into communities that had always harbored outsiders and secrets. What would you do if you discovered your children's DNA had been weaponized by government scientists, turning them into living targets for elimination squads that would never stop hunting? The mountains were about to become a battlefield where human evolution itself hung in the balance. But the atomic fire burning in their genes was already spreading beyond any government's ability to contain. Evolution doesn't ask permission. It simply survives. The helicopters appeared over Beckley at dawn on October 12, 1967. their rotors chopping through morning mist like mechanical vultures descending on carrion. Federal agents in hazmat suits rappelled into remote hollows, while radiation detection equipment swept mountainsides for the atomic signatures that would betray hidden families. The sound of Geiger counters clicking became the new soundtrack of Appalachian terror, as Operation Cleansweep began its systematic hunt for every bloodline touched by Project Prometheus. This would be the government's final solution to contain an atomic experiment that had evolved beyond their worst nightmares. Agent David Kruger led the operation from a mobile command center established at the abandoned Pikes Ridge facility, the same underground complex where the original experiments had transformed 23 prisoners into something no longer entirely human. Military engineers had retrofitted the chambers with advanced detection equipment capable of identifying radiation signatures in human tissue from distances of up to 2 miles. Every hollow, every cabin, every cave system in a 100-square-mile radius would be systematically searched until no atomic descendant remained alive. The first family discovered was the Morrisons, hiding in a cave system near Summersville, where 3 generations had lived like subterranean creatures for over a decade. James Morrison's grandson had developed the ability to digest radioactive minerals directly, his stomach functioning as a biological reactor that converted uranium ore into usable energy. When federal agents found them, the children's eyes reflected light like nocturnal animals, and their skin registered radiation levels that should have been immediately lethal. The Morrison family didn't resist capture. They emerged from their caves with the resigned dignity of people who'd known this day would eventually come. Their mutations so advanced that normal human society was no longer an option. Medical teams documented their abilities with clinical fascination before loading them onto transport helicopters that disappeared into gray October skies. Official records listed them as relocated for their own safety, but no relocation facility existed. Word of the government sweep spread through mountain communities faster than wildfire, carried by networks of hunters, moonshiners, and coal miners who'd learned to distrust federal authority generations before atomic experiments made their suspicions prophetic. Families with even distant connections to Project Prometheus, survivors began fleeing deeper into wilderness areas where helicopters couldn't land and radiation detectors became useless among natural uranium deposits. The Holloway family received warning from a cousin who'd spotted federal vehicles near their old homestead. Thomas made the agonizing decision to abandon their cabin and move his family into the deepest cave system he could find, a limestone network that extended for miles beneath Blair Mountain. The caves provided natural shielding from radiation detection, but living underground accelerated the mutations in his children, particularly Ruth, whose abilities had grown increasingly unstable. From Agent Kruger's operational log, October 18, 1967, subject family Holloway remains at large despite extensive aerial surveillance. Radiation signatures detected in Sector 7 caves suggest large population concentration. Recommend deployment of specialized extraction teams with underground combat training. The underground pursuit became a nightmare of narrow passages and radioactive ambushes. Federal agents found themselves hunting people who could see in absolute darkness, who could phase through solid rock, who could survive in environments that would kill normal humans within hours. Several extraction teams simply vanished into the cave systems, their radio signals cutting out as they pursued targets who understood the underground terrain better than any surface dweller could imagine. Ruth Holloway, now 5 years old, had become something unprecedented in human evolution. Her mutations had stabilized into abilities that allowed her to manipulate atomic particles at the molecular level, essentially giving her control over matter itself. When federal agents cornered her family in a limestone chamber 300 feet underground, she demonstrated powers that made government scientists realize they were no longer hunting the descendants of their experiment. They were hunting the next step in human evolution. The standoff lasted 6 hours. Thomas Holloway negotiated with Agent Kruger through cave acoustics that carried voices for miles through stone corridors, offering to surrender himself if his children were allowed to live in peace. But Kruger's orders were explicit. No atomic bloodline could be permitted to survive. The genetic mutations had to be terminated completely, regardless of the subject's cooperation or potential value. What followed defied every scientific principle the government thought they understood about radiation and human biology. Ruth Holloway, responding to the threat against her family, somehow triggered a localized atomic reaction that collapsed 3 miles of cave system while leaving her family completely unharmed. Federal agents on the surface detected a seismic event equivalent to a small nuclear detonation, but no radioactive fallout emerged from the collapsed caves. The incident forced a complete reevaluation of Operation Cleanse Sweep. The atomic descendants weren't just surviving their mutations, they were evolving into something that could defend itself against conventional military intervention. Intelligence reports suggested that similar incidents were occurring wherever federal forces encountered advanced atomic families, turning the extermination campaign into an undeclared war between human and post-human species. Local populations, initially supportive of federal efforts to remove the atomic freaks from their communities, began changing their attitudes as stories spread of children who could heal with a touch, elderly family members who could divine water sources during droughts, and young adults whose unusual abilities protected entire communities from natural disasters. What would you do if you discovered that your government was systematically hunting and killing people whose only crime was carrying mutations inflicted on their grandparents by that same government? If evolution itself had become an enemy of the state, the war between atomic and normal humanity was about to escalate beyond anything either side could have imagined. But deep in collapsed caves, where reality bent around atomic fire, something new was beginning to emerge from the genetic chaos of Project Prometheus. The atoms had learned to fight back. The collapsed limestone cathedral stretched 300 feet in every direction, its ceiling lost in shadows that defied the phosphorescent glow emanating from the walls themselves. Here, 200 feet beneath Blair Mountain, the surviving atomic families had built something unprecedented in human history, a civilization powered entirely by radioactive DNA and sustained by mutations that transformed deadly stone into living architecture. The air hummed with energy that made normal Geiger counters useless, while children who had never seen sunlight moved through passages carved by their own atomic abilities. This subterranean refuge would become the birthplace of a new species that no government could ever hope to control or eliminate. Ruth Holloway, now 8 years old, had become the unofficial leader of the underground community despite her age. Her ability to manipulate atomic particles had evolved to the point where she could restructure matter at the molecular level, transforming barren cave systems into livable spaces, complete with freshwater sources, breathable air circulation, and chambers that provided perfect growing conditions for the phosphorescent fungi that served as their primary food source. The other children deferred to her naturally, recognizing an authority that transcended normal human social structures. The community that formed in those caves represented survivors from 17 different atomic families, their bloodlines tracing back to 12 of the original 23 Project Prometheus subjects. Over the past decade, they had developed their own culture, language, and customs adapted to their unique biological needs. Marriage occurred between individuals whose radiation signatures complemented each other, producing children whose abilities often exceeded those of their parents in both power and stability. Communication happened through methods that would have seemed impossible to surface dwellers. Ruth could transmit complex thoughts by manipulating electromagnetic frequencies generated by her nervous system, essentially turning her brain into a biological radio transmitter. Others had developed the ability to leave atomic signatures in stone walls, creating messages that could be read by family members weeks or months later. The caves themselves became a vast communication network, with information flowing through limestone corridors faster than any conventional technology could match. Food production had evolved beyond traditional agriculture into something resembling controlled atomic synthesis. The community had learned to cultivate specialized organisms that thrived in radioactive environments, creating protein sources that actually enhanced their mutations rather than fighting against them. They bred luminescent fish in underground pools, grew crystalline vegetables that absorbed uranium directly from cave walls, and maintained herds of pale, eyeless cattle whose meat provided the specific isotopes their children needed for proper development. From a journal recovered during later excavations attributed to Sarah Morrison, dated January 15, 1969, "The little ones born down here are different even from us. They don't need the surface world at all. Ruth says they're what we were supposed to become all along before the government tried to poison us out of existence." Sometimes I think she's right. Sometimes I wonder if we're not the freaks, maybe we're the future. The underground society developed its own justice system based on atomic principles rather than traditional law. Crimes were rare, partly because telepathic abilities made deception nearly impossible. But when disputes arose, they were settled through processes that involved direct sharing of memories and emotions. Punishment, when necessary, involved temporary isolation from the community's collective consciousness, a fate worse than death for people who had evolved beyond individual existence. Education focused on skills necessary for survival in their unique environment. Children learned to navigate by electromagnetic signatures, to identify safe radiation levels by taste and smell, to communicate across vast distances using atomic resonance. Traditional subjects, like reading and mathematics, were adapted to their needs. They developed a written language based on atomic symbols, and their mathematics incorporated concepts of nuclear physics that would have challenged university professors on the surface. The most remarkable development was the emergence of what could only be described as a collective consciousness. The atomic families had begun sharing memories, experiences, and knowledge at the cellular level, creating a community intelligence that exceeded the sum of its individual parts. When one person learned a new skill, others could absorb that knowledge through direct DNA contact. When someone died, their memories and experiences became permanently encoded in the community's genetic database. This collective evolution accelerated when the underground society made contact with other atomic communities that had formed in similar cave systems throughout Appalachia. Using their ability to manipulate electromagnetic fields, they established communication networks that connected isolated groups across hundreds of miles. What the government had intended as scattered hiding places were becoming nodes in a vast underground civilization. The surface world above remained largely unaware of the post-human society developing beneath their feet. Occasional hikers reported strange lights in deep caves or encounters with pale figures who vanished into solid rock. But these stories were dismissed as mountain folklore or the hallucinations of people who'd spent too much time in uranium-rich environments. But Ruth Holloway, now approaching adolescence, had begun experiencing visions that suggested their isolation wouldn't last forever. She could sense the atomic signatures of surface dwellers, feel the fear and hatred directed toward her people, and perceive the government's continued efforts to locate and eliminate them. Most troubling were her glimpses of a future where the boundary between surface and underground could no longer be maintained. What would you do if you discovered that evolution was happening beneath your feet, that your government's attempt to commit genocide had accidentally created a superior species that was rapidly outgrowing its underground prison? The atomic children were ready to inherit the Earth, whether the surface world accepted them or not. But first, they would have to survive one final government assault, designed to end their existence permanently. The caves whispered with atomic dreams. The atomic bombs fell at 6:37 a.m. on April 4th, 1972, not on foreign enemies, but on American soil. 3 tactical nuclear devices detonated simultaneously above the cave systems of Blair Mountain, Paint Creek, and Summersville. The explosions registered magnitude 4.2 on seismic monitors across the eastern seaboard, while radioactive fallout drifted over 5 counties that had harbored the underground atomic civilization for nearly 15 years. Official reports blamed the detonations on an experimental mining operation that had accidentally triggered underground gas deposits. This would be the government's ultimate solution to eliminate evidence of Project Prometheus and its evolving descendants once and for all. President Nixon had authorized Operation Final Purge after intelligence reports confirmed that the atomic communities were no longer hiding. They were actively expanding. Reconnaissance satellites detected thermal signatures indicating underground populations in the thousands, while electromagnetic anomalies suggested the development of technology that exceeded anything in the conventional military arsenal. The decision to use nuclear weapons against American citizens required authorization from the highest levels of government, justified through classified national security directives that would remain buried for decades. The underground detonations were designed to collapse the entire cave system network, burying the atomic civilization under millions of tons of irradiated stone. Military planners calculated that even if some individuals survived the initial explosions, the resulting radiation levels would be lethal to any form of human life within hours. What they failed to consider was that their targets had evolved beyond conventional human biology. Ruth Holloway, now 15 years old and the acknowledged leader of the underground nation, sensed the approaching attack through electromagnetic disturbances that preceded the bombers by 47 minutes. Her abilities had evolved to the point where she could manipulate atomic forces on a massive scale, essentially functioning as a human nuclear reactor capable of both destruction and creation. As the tactical warheads descended toward their targets, she made a decision that would redefine the relationship between atomic and normal humanity forever. Instead of trying to escape the nuclear assault, Ruth absorbed it. Her body, and those of the other advanced atomic descendants, somehow converted the incoming radiation into pure energy that reinforced rather than destroyed their cellular structure. The underground communities didn't just survive the nuclear attack, they were strengthened by it, their mutations reaching new levels of stability and power. The aftermath created a radioactive wasteland on the surface, while leaving the underground civilization not only intact, but thriving in an environment that would kill normal humans within minutes. Government monitoring stations detected radiation readings that defied scientific understanding, with some areas registering levels that should have been impossible without ongoing nuclear reactions. Emergency response teams sent to assess the damage simply vanished, their radio signals cutting out as they entered the contamination zones. From a classified military report dated April 7, 1972, reconnaissance flights over target zones reveal no signs of surface survival, but underground thermal signatures remain active and appear to be expanding. Radiation levels exceed measurement capabilities of standard equipment. Recommend complete quarantine of affected areas indefinitely. Local populations were evacuated under cover of environmental disaster, with residents relocated to distant states and sworn to secrecy about the unusual circumstances surrounding their displacement. The affected counties were declared federal disaster zones, permanently off-limits to civilian access. Warning signs and military checkpoints were established around a perimeter that eventually encompassed over 200 square miles of contaminated Appalachian territory. But the nuclear attack had an unintended consequence that military planners never anticipated. The massive radiation doses triggered a final evolutionary leap in the atomic descendants, transforming them from a hidden underground society into something that could no longer be contained by conventional barriers. They developed the ability to phase through solid matter at will, to exist simultaneously in multiple dimensions, and to manipulate reality itself at the quantum level. Ruth Holloway, emerged from the irradiated caves 3 days after the nuclear attack. Walking through solid steel barriers as if they were mist, she appeared in the Pentagon briefing room where Operation Final Purge had been planned, materializing in front of military officials who were celebrating what they believed was the successful elimination of the atomic threat. Her presence in the most secure building in America demonstrated that conventional defenses were meaningless against beings who had evolved beyond physical limitations. The confrontation lasted 17 minutes. Ruth communicated directly with the military leadership through methods that bypassed spoken language, downloading information about government intentions, capabilities, and future plans directly into their consciousness. She left them with an ultimatum: cease all attempts to eliminate her people, or face consequences that would make their nuclear attack seem insignificant. The government response was immediate and terrified. Emergency protocols were activated to establish a permanent containment zone around the irradiated territories, while research programs were launched to develop weapons capable of fighting enemies who existed partially outside normal spacetime. The atomic descendants had evolved from victims of government experimentation into an existential threat that challenged humanity's dominance of the planet. What would you do if you discovered that your species' attempt to commit genocide had accidentally created its own replacement? If the children you tried to exterminate had become gods with the power to erase you from existence, the war between human and post-human had entered its final phase, with the outcome determining which species would inherit the Earth. Local legends still speak of lights that dance through the abandoned counties, of voices that whisper from contaminated forests, and of children born with eyes that glow like stars. They say the atomic descendants are still down there, growing stronger with each passing year, waiting for the day when they no longer need to hide from the surface world that created and then tried to destroy them. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.